Jason Harris, thank you so much for inviting me out to Purdue University. Yeah. This is my first time out here. Actually, my first time in Indiana, actually.
Oh, okay. Well,
so
welcome.
This is a real treat, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me, first, actually, before we get even into this, give me a fun fact about the area. What do you love about being out here?
Oh, you caught me off guard there. What do I love about Indiana? Well, I'm not originally from here, and I lived all around, the U.S. But I think it's really the people. I mean, there's truly that Midwest charm and politeness, friendliness that the Midwest has that I haven't seen in many other places that I've lived. So
yeah, I love that about the Midwest as well. All right, so where did you grow up then?
I grew up in Baltimore.
Cool.
Yeah,
Baltimore,
very different than here.
I bet. Yeah. What were your folks doing out there?
Well, my mother mostly raised, I'm the oldest of four, come from a very blue collar family. I was actually the first, to go to college. So my father was a tile, worker, tile layer, and my grandfather before him as well. And
wow.
Yeah. So.
Okay. You decided to become an engineer of sorts?
No, actually, I call myself a mutt, if you will, and no offense to mutts out there, but I have just a varied background. So originally I wanted to go to med school. I decided to, pursue biology, and then went to college and decided that wasn't what I wanted to do, but I still went into biology, got a degree in biology, marine science, and a minor in chemistry. And, decided just by chance, I got into nuclear, and then got a degree in nuclear engineering and then health physics.
Yada over it though. What's that by chance? How did you, what led you into that path?
Yeah, well, and again, I'll use another, I mentioned I'm a mutt, but what I also tend to tell people is, my path is like an electron, right? So that's where the engineering or physicist comes out is, it's a very tortuous path. Right? The electron moves along, hits something, and, goes in a complete opposite direction. And that was the case with me, really, when I look at my life and where I'm at now. There have been a few decisions that have really changed the direction that I've gone. And one was getting into nuclear engineering. And that occurred after I graduated from college. I thought of going to graduate school, again, in biology, but things just didn't really work out. So I took a job for a couple years in more environmental toxicity testing, which is kind of my background. But then by chance, a person that I was dating that would end up being my wife, who's here at Purdue as well, she took a job at a startup company. It was an R&D startup company that was doing work in clean energy, various clean energy areas. It's called Clean Energy Technologies, by fact. And so they worked on a number of areas, but they needed scientists to work specifically on a couple of technologies that they were developing. One was radioactive waste amelioration, and another was tritium separation. And so I went in to work in this area that I had, absolutely no background. I mean, I had some lab skills, so that's why I was hired. And, again, got into understanding, nuclear energy and nuclear waste and, again, tritium separation. And that just, took us in a completely different, trajectory. Cool. And so we had and the way, I guess, what led or how things changed from there is one of the consultants for the company was Dr. George Miley, who's a professor at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and in the nuclear engineering department there. And when things were kind of we were struggling a bit with the company, he mentioned to both myself and my soon-to-be wife, why don't you, come back to graduate school, or have you thought about graduate school in nuclear engineering with what you're doing? And we made that jump. And again, that kind of led us to where we're at now. So we both went there, got our master's. I ended up coming back here for my PhD, and my wife stayed there for her PhD in nuclear. Yeah.
So before we get into your PhD, let's actually talk about the work that you did at that startup for a second. You broke it down into two different pieces, tritium separation. Can you help me understand what is tritium being separated from?
Yeah, so the application there was, and this did end up leading to some of my PhD work, was, tritium is radioactive hydrogen, right? It's a byproduct in the nuclear generation process, right? It's created both as a fission product, but also through other neutron activation reactions.
So it's a hydrogen with a couple extra neutrons?
Yeah, a couple extra neutrons, right. So hydrogen has 3 isotopes, right? There's 3 forms of hydrogen. Regular hydrogen, or protium, I think is what it's called. Deuterium, which has a neutron, and then tritium, which has 2 neutrons.
Okay.
So it's the radioactive form of hydrogen, has a half-life of about 12.3 years. It's fairly low energy beta, so there's not a lot of issues with it from a dose standpoint, but it is produced in quite large volumes in the nuclear generation process. And essentially, wherever you have water, if you have tritium, or if you have water, you have tritium, right? You got hydrogen, you got tritium, exactly.
And tritium is also very valuable for military purposes, for fusion people. They love tritium.
Yeah. So, but because it's such a small element, right? It's very difficult to separate, especially separating, again, tritium from deuterium and normal hydrogen, especially with water. So
let me ask, the tritium, is it still, in water, is it still bonded to an oxygen?
It is. It's so
you've got kind of a lopsided oxygen with like one tritium on one side and one normal hydrogen on the other.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the main compound that you have. It's usually HTO, right?
Yeah.
So it's a regular hydrogen atom, a tritium atom, and then the oxygen.
And then how do you actually separate it from your normal water molecules?
Yeah, well, that's where it's very difficult. So we were working on a technology that the owner of the company, the creator of the company, had some patents for. He used to work for DuPont, and he developed this hollow core fiber with a mesh inside. So essentially, you could get you made a very semi-permeable membrane, if you will. It was a double layer, and it was able to actually do that. So you could draw, tritiated water through it, and it would separate.
So just totally
hydrogen.
mechanically,
yes,
you can separate them.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So
and then what? Once you've got the tritium, once you get the tritiated water, do you call it? What do? Do you just ship it off to someone in that state, or then you have to further remove the hydrogen and oxygen from that?
No, we were able to actually separate it. So once it was separated, they have what we did was the separated. Once you ran it through this column with these fibers or these hollow core fibers and this mesh, then you could freeze it at different temperatures. So tritiated water and normal water has slightly different freezing points. Yeah, so you could separate it that way. So that's what we would do. But here's the issue. It was very energy intensive, right, for the process. And so we did have some. We had some vendors and some nuclear power plants that were interested, or energy companies that were interested in the technology. And so they did some pilot studies with us, and eventually it didn't make it. Just because it was so energy intensive. You couldn't get the volumes that they wanted to be able to separate.
You want.
Yeah, exactly.
Classic.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So, all right, so go back to grad school, and what do you focus your efforts on there?
Yeah, well, that also kind of was somewhat torturous. So again, we were brought in by Dr. George Miley, and his area was more, he was doing plasma physics, or fusion, I should say. So inertial electrostatic confinement, so IEC fusion. And then also, he was known for doing a lot of work in low energy nuclear reactions, LENR.
A kind of little abstract field there. Yeah, I've only heard a little bit about it, but has anything ever manifested in the LENR field?
Not so much. Yeah, and he was tied to a lot of the cold fusion work, which made it very controversial. So we started to work there, and then I realized that my interests were still kind of tied to the biology, looking at the health effects and the potential health effects from nuclear. So I worked for him for a little bit, but then ended up doing my master's with a different advisor, more in the health physics area, nuclear power health physics.
Okay, so let's talk about health physics.
Okay.
How has the theory changed over the years? From my reading of history, you got this linear no threshold theory that was manifested in 1947. That's 6 years before Watson and Crick discovered DNA, and it hasn't changed since.
Nope.
But our understanding definitely has evolved since.
Yeah.
So can you talk me through how you have seen the history of this field evolve?
Yeah, well, I'll try. Yeah, that's a very controversial topic still, the LNT, and right. It's
why is it controversial?
Yeah. Well, I think because as more research is done, as we've accumulated data, we've seen that model doesn't hold in all situations.
Yeah.
Now, as a health physicist, then I'd argue that it has its place, especially for regulatory purposes, right? It's a very clean, easy model to use.
I'm going to put a pin in that. Keep going, but we're going to come back to that later.
So I see the benefit there, and that's why I think so many, the U.S. and the rest of the world uses it and has kind of stuck with that. But if you look at individual scenarios or situations, right, or for an example, I should say, cancer development, right? Different cancers, we've shown that LNT, or it's been shown that LNT is not the case, right? That's not the model in the formation, the initiation, promotion, and development of tumors and cancers. So I think that's where there's a lot of controversy. Of course, again, it's very expensive, right? Or for a lot of industries. To follow the LNT model, because again, you're assuming that any dose of radiation has some effect.
But then wouldn't that be the clear case that it is not a good regulatory standard if it is making industry more expensive and thus making certain businesses harder to operate, which might yield on net far greater, more positive health effects? Isn't it then a terrible regulatory model to follow?
Well, you think, but I think the regulators look at it as being independent, right? If we take our own regulator, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, their stance is that they don't support any industry, right? They can't show favoritism towards any, right?
Right, but their mission is adequate protection of public health, not ultimate protection of public health.
Right.
And at the end of the day, if it's public health that we care about and not just protection from radiation, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you should always be making the decision that yields the greatest public health outcome.
Right.
Yeah. So if, making nuclear so expensive that it can't compete with coal for the last 50 years means that millions of Americans have died, that is the worst public health outcome.
That's true, right. And I think, again, I think there are arguments that are being made, and there's some change to that, right? Even NRC's process of going to this risk-informed approach has changed that a little, but it still is not increasing the speed at which regulations are changed, or in the case of nuclear power and new reactor designs is not increasing that process or the speed of that process. So it's still very problematic. And part of the issue too is there are still some debates and differences in the science. Yeah. Right. So again, some have shown different models, but others have shown that maybe LNT does hold, especially at the cellular level, right, where we are seeing some detriment.
Yes. So let's differentiate between that, because the cellular, for instance, working out. At the cellular level, I'm hurting myself. I will literally tear cells, kill them. They'll be flushed out of my body. They'll be dead, those cells. But you know what? I get stronger. I get healthier over time because our body is designed to have a stress response.
Yes.
So one could even say, even if you're able to show detrimental effects from radiation at the cellular level, that's not a reason not to have radiation, because you might actually have a response to that stress that clears out the weak cells.
That's right. Yeah, adaptive response and mutation that leads to a stronger organism, right? Stronger species. So that's true. I believe that. I don't want to go on record as saying that I'm.
You're on record now. You got to go on record.
Right. There's this idea of hormesis, right, where radiation is good. And I believe that's true to some extent. But again, if you look at the research, there are conflicting studies that have been shown that, again, at the cellular or tissue level, you do have some detriment that is not creating or causing adaptive response that's leading to, again, a stronger species. There's still some again, debate and data that's showing the opposite of that. And another thing that is still what I think is keeping LNT around and keeping it alive is that we still don't have a biomarker or a mechanism for cancer development, right? So we have radiation, we still don't know what the process from beginning to end is, what's happening along the way. Right. And until that happens, I think it's going to be difficult to move away from that.
Yeah, it sucks because it sucks that we're stuck to a model that even though we might not be able to scientifically disprove, we've got plenty of practical evidence that we can inform our decision-making process to say, let's regulate industry in this way or that way.
That's right.
Let's talk about how radionuclides move through the environment. Like, where are they present in our lives? Where are they a threat? Where does health physics, what are all the different avenues that health physics becomes relevant?
Yeah, so obviously, as a health physicist and nuclear engineer and biologist, right? Radiation is ultimately, there's risk versus benefit with everything that we do with it, right? So we know that there's tremendous benefit in the use of radiation, radioactive materials, but in a lot of the technologies where radiation is emitted, there is some byproduct, right? And so, of course, we've seen that with nuclear weapons. Fallout, right? There is still a little bit of, activity left from the fission products that have occurred. So we still see that throughout the biosphere. We do see it in nuclear power generation, although it's very insignificant, right? As part of normal operations. Again, the fission process, nuclear power plants are going to release radionuclides into the environment, either as a gaseous pathway, so in the air, or as a liquid, into bodies of water that they're on. So, that's one of the bigger ones. And then in other nuclear fuel cycle facilities, again, they're going to have waste, tailings, et cetera, that are also going to get into the environment.
And different radionuclides interact with biology differently, right? Yep. Because some are a lot of things that are might be bad for our body in high concentrations, as we introduce them into our biological system, it just passes it through. Like if I were to eat a little bit of plutonium, I would just poop it out, essentially.
Yeah, mostly.
But others might stick in my system, like strontium, cesium, or iodine, because they fit into the biological processes in one way or another.
Yeah.
When we look back at the data, let's say from Chernobyl, where that was the biggest release that we could really imagine. A graphite reactor caught on fire, spread all this stuff around, really nasty stuff just kind of going all over. And we look at the data of how that actually kind of moved through the environment, moved through organisms. What have we found in terms of which of the hundreds of different radionuclides that might come out of a reactor, which actually stick in our body, which are actually harmful?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple ways to look at that. One, we look at ones that are that have long enough half-lives, right, that they stick around in the environment. So a great example of that is cesium, right? Cesium-137 specifically, 30-year half-life. So it's going to be around for, even if 7 half-lives go by, you're down to about 1%, right, of what's left. But still, even after a few half-lives, that's 100 years or so that it's in the environment. Strontium-90, as you mentioned as well, is going to be in the environment as well. And so it really depends when they're released. I guess how they distribute through the environment is really depends on their chemical form, right? So some things will go out in the environment and stick there, right? So cesium is a good example of that. It binds very well to different types of soils and clays, so they tend to stay there, and you're not going to have a lot of uptake, by individuals. Now, that's different if you're eating crops or vegetables, right, that are planted in the soils that contain it, then you may have some uptake. But for the most part, a lot of that stays in the environment. But you're right, it really depends on the well, it's based on the element, right? This is a chemical issue, not necessarily a radioactive issue.
Yeah.
Right? So iodine, right, is taken up readily by the thyroid gland and can cause issues there. So, that's one of the ones we have to worry about as well, but that has a fairly short half-life. So you worry about it in the beginning, and then, that you don't have to after a while.
Right. And so like in nuclear waste, if iodine, let's say 131, the one that we've deemed as dangerous because it's got a short enough half-life that it emits enough radiation, but not too short a half-life that's just totally gone within seconds. Let's say iodine 131, we know that's got a half-life of something like 8 days or something.
Yep,
So within a couple months, it's all gone. So that means none of our nuclear waste even has iodine 131 in it.
Correct.
The one thing that's ever hurt people from the Chernobyl accident.
Yeah.
So why are we worried about nuclear waste if it doesn't even have the one harmful radioactive element?
That's right. Unfortunately, it's a political problem, right? You probably, you talk to others about this, and that's what I think radioactive waste is, right?
Yeah.
You can provide all these statistics about, if you look at all the U.S. radioactive waste that we have, the spent nuclear fuel, you can put it in a stadium or barely fill, any big stadium that you have around the country. I mean, it's really insignificant. It's a political problem. Now, granted, you still do have fission products in there, transuranics that will last hundreds, thousands of years or more. But you're right, they're not the ones that we have to worry about.
Right. And stuff, like chlorine is dangerous biology in high concentrations, and we keep it in our cupboard, and it lasts infinity long, whereas, these long-lived actinides might last millions of years long. Right. And what we do for chlorine, if we don't like it, we just dilute it, flush it down the drain.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
So, we could do that to nuclear waste, is just flush it down the drain.
That's true. That's probably not a popular opinion.
Not popular, but why not?
Yeah.
Why not? Why do we let these things become not popular opinions? Why don't we just kind of speak frankly about it and be confident when we do?
Well, we kind of do that already in certain instances, maybe not with waste. And I think because that term is out there and, people, but there's still this right, NIMBY attitude, right? Or, not my backyard, or even nope, not on planet Earth as well, right? Where they don't want to see it at all. You haven't heard that yet? Nope. Yeah, not on planet Earth. Right?
That's perfect.
Yes,
that's just so perfect.
Right, for those that are completely against that. But again, we do that anyway, right? I mentioned nuclear power operations, right? that's what you're doing. You're diluting a waste stream that you deem as not being harmful at all. And that's what's, has to be done in Fukushima as well, right? They're going to have to start releasing that water. And, Pacific Ocean is a big ocean. You're going to have dilution.
It's as big as it can get. There's just it's just anything diluted in the ocean is just so insignificant.
Yeah, it is. Right. Yeah. Now, you do have, again, there is some concern of getting some bioaccumulation in some of the species, in some of the organisms.
Now, let me ask you about that, because so I can speak to a real expert about this. As far as I understand, elements can bioaccumulate through biological processes, right? But isotopes, since they're chemically, for the most part, chemically indistinguishable from each other, the longer that they're in the environment, moving around, mixing with things, they will biodilute with respect to each other.
Yes, right.
So, and then by that mechanism, so let's say iodine, right? So let's say we really didn't like iodine 131. Sure. We had to deal with it immediately. If we just dumped a bunch of normal iodine, 127, is that normal iodine? 127 on it, our body it would be like self-saturate with a normal iodine to the point where it wouldn't uptake enough of the harmful iodine.
Yep.
So in theory, the longer something's in the environment, the less harmful it is, because it's more likely to just biodilute with respect to the other isotopes.
Yeah, that's definitely the case for elements that our body typically uses, right? And iodine is a prime example of that. But if you have, say, plutonium, certain transuranics that, are not naturally part of the environment, and you take those up, right? That's not something that again, your body's used to or your body uses.
Right. Well, any heavy metal, right? Any heavy metal is going to be harmful to the body. So, okay, so tell me about your research now. What do you focus on?
Okay.
How do you?
Yeah. So, I've done a couple different things. Again, getting back to the electron analogy. So did some work in, again, looking at the dose impact from nuclear power emissions. So did
what
that
is a
work
dose impact?
for nothing or minimal? Yes,
yeah,
minimal.
crazy.
So which is good,
yeah,
right?
Great.
So I partook in studies over the course of a decade, looking at every nuclear power plant in the U.S., what they release through effluents, both the gaseous effluents, liquid effluents, and also waste, and looking at the doses, right, from those, looking at the environmental monitoring data that comes from that, as every power plant has a very comprehensive monitoring program around the plant to make sure that what they release is not accumulating in the environment and providing some harm to individuals or the environment itself.
And what about remediation sites like Hanford and stuff like that? Have you looked at that stuff at all?
Not really. Most of mine was with nuclear power plants, but also comparing those to some of the accidents, right? Chernobyl, Fukushima as well. With some of the few other, sites and fuel cycle facilities, there's probably a little more concern because of the amounts of activity that they're dealing with. And if there's, I think for the most part, the operations at all those facilities are wonderful, but you do hear of incidents, and those are what make it to the news and, cause concern of public and government officials. But for the most part, whether it be Hanford, Idaho National Labs, Savannah Riverside, all of these, they're, I think, doing the best that they can. And for the most part, everything is contained and is not harmful to the environment or the people living around the sites.
And what happened in Fukushima? How much radioactive material, radionuclides, source term, how much actually got off the site?
Not a lot. I mean, when you consider, if you look at the total emissions, right, it's still more than an order of magnitude less than what Chernobyl released. Right. So, pretty insignificant. And, Fukushima, that incident, I mean, one thing, I've written a couple articles and op-eds about that incident, and what I think people are so focused on Fukushima and the reactor and what was released there. But if you really look at the harm that the earthquake did, the flooding, and how that impacted the local industry and even other chemical, exactly, right. So the releases that occurred to those sites were, were considerable, much worse than what we have with Fukushima.
In terms of the health on...
in terms of health
And so how come Fukushima wasn't a moment to then flip the regulatory script and say, it turns out that light water reactors don't need an emergency planning zone at all, but chemical plants need an emergency planning zone, and all the regulatory burden and headache and public fear that spreads along with it. How come we didn't use this as a turning point and say, hey, Fukushima, light water reactor meltdown, not that bad?
Right. No, that's a good question. I mean, there are some regulations in place, obviously. It's just, it still goes back to, I think some of the fear, the concerns that people have with radiation. I think that's changing, though. I honestly do. I think, as people get older, they start to forget. Right, you have less and less incidents. And even with Fukushima, I have to say, I think, if you look at all the various polls that have been done about nuclear power and just nuclear radiation in general and people's, opinion about it, we are seeing, an increased support. So I think even Fukushima did not do the damage, say, that Chernobyl did and TMI did before it. People are starting to accept technology. They see that it's safe. Right, you have one incident that occurs, every decade or two.
And since utilities don't have a spine to stick up to the NRC, what if I were to lobby and say, I want all utilities that have a light water reactor to not have this burden of an emergency planning zone anymore? What evidence would I bring to them? What research would I show them to say the off-site radionuclide contamination does not pose a public health hazard like an earthquake or this or that does?
Well, I mean, I think you can show the operational history of the plants, right? Where we have, just under 100 operating plants now. But if you look at the combined operating experience, it's, several.
What if I wanted to make the case that worst case scenario, they all melt down tomorrow, still not a public health hazard off-site in terms of radioactive contamination, as from the data from Fukushima?
Right.
How would I make that case?
Yeah. Oh, that's tough. I mean, you could show that even with the releases that, they're still well below the dose limits. It still gets back, unfortunately, to what we talked about earlier, which is the LNT, right? It's still using that, that model of saying, well, any increase in dose or any dose is, leads to an effect. So I think it's still hard to get past that. They're still driven by and have to follow, that model, which is in the regulations.
And what do the LNT people say when you look at Colorado, which has a higher background dose than, where are we, Lafayette?
West Lafayette. Yeah,
West Lafayette.
Right.
West Lafayette.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you see the difference in background radiation, and that's a large enough population size to do these statistical measurements, and you don't see any uptick in cancer, how can the LNT people possibly say that there isn't at least a threshold at Denver level?
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, I mean, I think they argue that there's just too many, there's too many unknowns, too many parameters when you look at it.
But I would argue, researchers do just to keep a job, they just always say, oh, it's too complex, we need to keep researching.
Well, I bring this up in classes because we do discuss this exact thing that you mentioned, and to really get the statistics that you need to prove that point, you have to have a population in
a million.
Not even. I mean, you're looking into the billions.
Billions.
Really. Yeah, decent statistics, tens of millions. You need that kind of population to look at the health studies. But yeah, I agree with that. I mean, Colorado is one of the. I think actually I saw something that's the healthiest state to live in, right? And
maybe it's because they have a little bit of radiation.
Have a little bit of radiation. That's right. Maybe.
That's great. Yeah. So, sorry, I cut you off. What are some of the other topics that you focus on?
Yeah. So, I still do a little bit of that work, but again, getting back to the electron scenario, my work has taken me more into the nuclear security area. And again, just by chance, I've always been involved in kind of, I like to say, big projects and looking at the big picture with things when it comes to nuclear. So looking at large educational programs, to educate our students and others in these areas. But, before I came back to Purdue as a professor, I was in Idaho State University, had a joint appointment with Idaho National Lab, and also was the associate director for the Center for Advanced Energy Studies, which is out there. And just got I guess kind of out of the blue, contacted by someone at the International Atomic Energy Agency who was putting together kind of an education program in nuclear security, which did not exist.
Cool.
Right? So essentially after 9/11, there was real concern about the possibility of using nuclear and radiological materials for malicious purposes, specifically for a terrorist attack.
And what kind of terrorist attack do they think? Would this be like dirty bombs? Would this be actual nuclear weapons?
Well, there's four scenarios that we consider. One would be what we call sub-state actor, right? So a group of individuals, terrorist organization, however you want to frame it, that would either get a hold of an intact nuclear weapon. All right, so obviously the consequences would be catastrophic if that were to happen, but the probability or the possibility of that happening is extremely low given, the security measures and safeguards we have in place. Getting nuclear material, right? So either U-235 or plutonium-239, enough of it to build their own and improvised nuclear device, which again would be catastrophic if that happened. And then the other, the one you mentioned, of course, is the dirty bomb or the radiological dispersal device. So getting radioactive material, fixing it to a conventional explosive and detonating it. So, from a destruction and loss of life standpoint, probably, or not as significant, but still, a significant event If you look at panic and decontamination that you'd have to worry about, those are kind of the scenarios. And then even sabotage or so someone going to a nuclear power plant and trying to create some damage that could maybe lead to a meltdown.
And with the dirty bomb scenario, I've often wondered about this. I mean, I guess it depends on what radioactive material you're fixing to the bomb. Yeah. But if it's just standard spent fuel rods or something, I mean, how much could you put on it? A few kilograms, and a few kilograms is
not going to
No. So there wouldn't really be much of a contamination there. What is the worry? What are they worried that they might get a hold of? Like which radioisotope that could actually, when fixed to a bomb, cause some serious contamination?
Yeah, I mean, for an RDD, you're right. It's really about the chemical form that you have. So the biggest worry is cesium-137, which, in a lot of applications is in a powder form, right? So it'd be easy to disperse. So you worry about that form, especially in a lot of medical, sources, right? For brachytherapy, for instance, you have these, cesium, and then what's been used in teletherapy sources as well for treatment. That would probably be the biggest concern. Cobalt-60 is also a concern, iridium-192. So those are the ones. And the concern there, in this radiological security space is that you do have large enough sources out there, right, that are in the order of, we'll use traditional units, curies, right, tens of curies or hundreds of curies. So if someone were to get a hold of that and fix that to a conventional explosive, that could cause some dose to individuals that would be close by enough maybe to cause fatality, but also, right, the spread of contamination. And if you're looking at cesium with 30-year half-life and, having to deal with that cleanup could be, significant.
One other thought on that, because when you spread out nuclear material, the effective dose to any given human would be less.
Right.
So wouldn't it be worse if it wasn't in bomb form, but they just kind of like tucked it in the frame of your door or something? So every day that you walk by.
I mean, yes.
When you want to keep it concentrated, it depends on
spreading it out. I mean, it depends on what the outcome is that you're looking for, right? The consequence. So. A lot of people were, from a financial standpoint, economic standpoint, even from an emotional, right?
Right. That's what I'm worried this all comes down to. It comes down to panic.
Exactly.
But then the best way to defeat panic isn't to show up with a bunch of guys with white suits. That spreads panic. The best way to defeat panic is just to be like, sorry, no big deal.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's true. Right. That's not going to happen though. But
it's so counterintuitive.
It is. But there have been incidents where individuals have used small amounts, but high activities, to place near somebody to provide a large enough dose.
Right, like the Russian assassins or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah. We talk about that. Yeah. Right.
Okay, cool. So you got roped into focusing on some security work.
Yeah, and so risk analysis. So
cool.
My group kind of specializes now in doing risk analysis and assessment for radiological security. So
and what do you guys do? You guys run computer models and come up with scenarios?
Yeah, exactly. So we've developed a model, probably one of the most comprehensive out there, to look at every possible parameter that determines risk at a facility. So again, we call it it's for radiological facilities. So those facilities that mainly have radioactive materials, non-nuclear materials. So hospitals, right, they could have large sources that they use for diagnosis and treatment of disease. Universities even, that could have fairly high activity sources for irradiations and other research means. So we developed a model that, again, looks at every possible parameter that affects risk. And so you're looking at things that could affect a facility. So even weather events, meteorology, so things that could impact security, right? So if you imagine, say you have a power outage and that knocks out your, security equipment, your detectors, your cameras, then by doing that, you're increasing the risk, right, to that facility if something occurs. So we look at every possible, again, physical parameter, but more importantly, we're looking at the human aspects, the human side, human factors, which is much more difficult to calculate.
Yeah, how do you factor in? Okay, that's a great one, because do you remember? I mean, this is so sad, but do you remember when, like, a couple years ago, there's this German pilot flying over the Alps and just kind of took the plane down?
Yeah, I just talked about that in a lecture the other day.
How do you factor that in? I mean, all these risk models for even these new nuclear plants that they're building, and they want to say, oh, it's ultimately passive safe, but what if someone's from the inside sabotages it, like some crazy operator or something? Yeah, it's like, how do you account for that in the models?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's very difficult, and there's really no right way. What we're using, or what we're looking at partially, is security culture, right? So you're looking at the culture of your organization, right? The attitudes, the beliefs, the behaviors of individuals. And so we've developed some assessment methods to do that. So it's hard to pinpoint on an individual unless you do, use some sort of surveillance at that level. But, looking at a facility as a whole, you can see, okay, is this a good place to work? Are people happy here? Or are there, potential, are there things brewing, right, that could lead to a disgruntled worker doing something? Yeah, that's right. So, we partially look at that. But you have to, again, it's so difficult to do. One thing that is being developed as well is using algorithms in concert, if you will, with sensors and AI to track individuals and see if they they're able to, I want to say, detect very subtle differences in behavior, right, to see if something is going to happen. And that doesn't have to be used only for security purposes, but for safety purposes. So a good example, what we're going to, I think, start researching here at our reactor, which, is the first, all digital reactor now in the U.S. Cool. Yeah, we just had
awesome.
We had a kind of a ribbon cutting ceremony a couple weeks.
Yeah, I can't wait to check it out later on this trip. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you could do if you're an operator at this, at the reactor, you could set up again, develop an algorithm to see if the operator is doing things that they shouldn't be doing, right? So are they, are there certain motions, certain behaviors, certain switches or whatever, devices that they're manipulating? Is that not normal or not typical operational behavior? Yeah. Right. So if you can start to detect that.
Why don't we just get rid of the operators altogether? Yeah. I mean, like, how many industrial machines that have, like, risk factors with I mean, a modern like gas relay station today has 0.5 people working it. Literally one guy handles two $300 million facilities. One guy for both of them. Yeah. So it's like, and we've had industrial automation forever. Why don't we just get rid of the operators?
I think, honestly, I think we're close to that, but you still have to have, we're not to the point where if a decision needs to be made, right, that, that a machine could do that.
But aren't there can't decision trees be set up in such a way that you can always fall back to, a way that would produce the least risky result? Like, no matter what, if you don't know everything, trip the reactor. It's like,
I think you could get to that, but I think
it's not like driving a car where there's like a police officer might come into the road, or a human with a bike. It's a static environment.
It is, but I think we've seen that there might be some scenarios that you still want a human that has experience, that has training to still follow what they should do, right, in a set of procedures. But if something still isn't quite right, you still have that experience to make that decision, to make that call. Yeah. Right. So, but
until it gets us in trouble. Sometimes it goes the wrong way, right? Sometimes even experienced people in different situations make the wrong decision. Yeah. I trust computers more.
Yeah, do you?
Well, in static environments, not in dynamic environments. Only in static environments do I trust computers more. Yeah.
And I think, but again, I think we're getting close to that. I know, military still, or military applications, I know your work with drones and such, that, the military still says, no, we want a human behind that, because you want them to make that decision, right?
Well, for killing people.
For killing people, exactly, right, yeah.
Yeah, I'll take
We're not talking about that.
Yeah, I'd like a human in the loop for that, please.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Or maybe not, because it gives them PTSD. I don't know. It actually could go either way.
Yeah, it could go either way. Right? Yeah.
It's complicated.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think we're getting to that, but we still don't, we still have to have jobs for people, right? We can't automate everything. And,
I agree, but wouldn't it be great if humans got to cherry pick the best jobs, like the best things in society that humans could be doing? Thinking deeply, thinking creatively, being social with each other. What if those were all of our jobs? And we anything that was dirty, dull, or dangerous, robots.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, operating a reactor, some people like that, right? That's an enjoyable job for some. So, you want a human there for that.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, great. What else have we left out? What else are some topics that you've become a master expert on these years?
I don't know. I don't want to say, there's a couple of the areas I still do a little detection work, but that's, again, just giving kind of the breadth of my education, the differences, it's led me to, get into different things and to, be interested in different things.
So since you've had this ability to kind of jump around and explore different topics and be so involved, maybe you could kind of use that kind of culmination of wisdom to kind of paint the picture of the future for us. How do you see things looking 10, 15, 20 years from now?
In what areas, though?
Let's say nuclear power specifically. Power, And you can rope in the aspects of, security, safeguards, whatever, if you'd like. But
Well, I'm still optimistic about nuclear power in the U.S., even though, plants are shutting down, and I think there will be a turn. It's got to happen soon, though, especially from an economic standpoint. Sure. I think a lot of us thought that regulations would kick in for natural gas, and that would help with softening the blow, if you will, with the difference in cost between those technologies. And nuclear is really hurting there. I still am optimistic that will happen, but it's got to happen soon, or I think we'll see a steady decline in large scale nuclear power within the U.S. Climate change is very important. I know you're going to talk about that later. But again, I think that's something that we've got to jump. We've got to get on that ship and really steer it the right way very soon, because the nuclear power argument for that is I think only going to hold water, if you will, for so long. And I think we need to look at other part of the problem with large scale nuclear is, well, not only cost, which is approaching $20 billion now to build a plant, right? But the time it takes as well, close to a decade.
You're right. Those are two problems. Yeah.
So so moving towards advanced nuclear, which I'm excited about, the SMRs or the micro reactors, I think those have real, there's real hope for those. But it still goes back to the point that we were talking about with regulations and being able to get those through the process quickly, and I think. We're making effort or making strides there, but it's got to happen soon for that to happen in the U.S. But nuclear, throughout the world is I think flourishing. And I've seen that with my security work, doing work for the IAEA and State Department, and traveling, across the world and educating people in those areas. They're very excited and they see nuclear as the way, as the energy of the future because of their own energy security needs and lack of resources. And so, I think internationally it's positive in that way. So, so I'm optimistic. That's why I'm in the field and, hope it continues.
Awesome.
For as long as possible.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.